I've just done a whole video on this subject without hitting play or record. In fact, of course, there is no play. Okay, so I'm going to do the Bookish Beginnings tag, which was set up or started by Reads and Daydreams. So thank you for that. I wasn't tagged, I just fancy doing it, and I'm unlikely to tag anyone because I always feel that that's a bit of an imposition. Um, um, I quite like the title Reads and Daydreams. I think mine should really be Reads and Naps, um, or falls asleep when reads, and that's not because of my advanced years, it's because I've always done that. It's really rather annoying. Um, but anyway, Bookish Beginnings. I think interesting, the first question is, what books did you enjoy as a child, or love to read as a child? And I didn't read as a child at all. I vaguely remember being read to as an infant, but I didn't read as a child, wasn't interested. In fact, actively rejected it, which is kind of interesting. I started reading, I mean, obviously I could read, I just want to point that out, at 14, I think, and I went in quite high. For some reason, my school teacher, my English teacher, like the rest of the class, decided he thought I might like Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and I did. And I sat in my room reading a very long Russian novel in translation, whilst listening to Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. And I can't read Crime and Punishment now without hearing Tangled Up in Blue in my head, and I can't listen to Blood on the Tracks without remembering reading Crime and Punishment. That synapse is perfectly formed in my head, and there is no break in it. So, in a sense, the first adult book I read was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I then went on to read a lot more Dostoevsky after that, and became almost probably stupendously pretentious because of it. The first classic, well, obviously that's a classic, I read, but if we're going to, let's say, step away from Russian literature, the first classic I read was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And I didn't, I mean, I really loved it, but it didn't lead me on to much more early or mid-century Victorian literature. Because I didn't read much English literature for the next 10 years. I was firmly stuck in Russia, France, and the United States. I don't think I really share a British or English sensibility in terms of what I like writing to be about. It's a little too reticent and slightly upper middle class, and it doesn't get into the real grit of human misery. And the Russians and the French are very good at that. And it doesn't quite have the wonder and charm of American novelists, or the style. Americans are great stylists. So that was the first classic. So I have my notes here. Book that made you realise a new style or read a new style. I read a lot of modernist stuff very early, so I think it's what poetry made me read more poetry. And if I go back to my late teens, early 20s, it was probably the work of E. E. Cummings. And if you're familiar with E. E. Cummings, then you'll know that he is a fairly easy poet to sort of find your way into poetry. I mean, I have to say I find him almost unreadable now. He feels sort of quite sentimental and adolescent. But I think it's probably being harsh, and we can often feel like that, but with writers that we read quite young. But I think there's a case to be made that E. Cummings didn't particularly mature. But I read poetry a lot now, and to a certain degree, it is thanks to him, and then slightly on to Rilke. First prize winner, well, it's a long time ago, but if I'm right, I think it was A.S. Byatt's Possession, which won the Booker Prize. And I know lots of people really love this book, but I really hate it. Maybe wrong time of life, not sure it was, I was particularly in the right place to read a novel about academics and 19th century poetry that read to me a bit like a soap opera, and with a very tacky, cheap ending that felt, yeah, once again like a soap opera. So I'm not, I've never read Eyre by it yet again, and never will because of that traumatizing experience. Books in translation. First ones in translation. Well, the first ones were in translation, and I read a lot of books in translation. Camus, Sartre, Proust, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, all Russian and French from 14 through to almost 25 or something. And so for a while, that was my understanding of what literature was. It was foreign language sense. It was the foreign sensibilities translated into the English language. I have friends who never read anything other than things in their native language because of what's missed, and certainly in poetry. But that's that degree of separation was something that I existed with for years. And I have to say now I read much more in English than in translation. But yeah, so translations were just part of my makeup, part of my reading life from the very beginning. And finally, about being on Booktube and a booktuber, I really enjoy it. I find it quite stressful because I tend to do them as kind of off the cuff one takes, and I try to be lucid and make sense, which isn't entirely isn't quite as easy as I make it seem, because clearly, but no, it's often doesn't seem that way. But this editing software is beyond me. It just gives me a headache thinking about it. So that's why I do it. I can't even work out how to put something at the beginning, at the end, and I'm not technologically illiterate. I just can't. But I like it. Because I'm watching other booktubers. I like talking about books I love. There's novels that I have discovered. So all good. Virtuous circle. Yeah, I think that's about it really. So thank you to Reads and Daydreams for starting this. And if I had to tag anyone, it would be A Hermit's Progress, and That's Who I Mean. And then there's Novel Experience as well. So if you feel like doing this, please do, but you're under no obligation. Many thanks.